sånn at vi legger ikke skjul på her på Oslo Symposium at vi henter noe inspirasjon fra USA. Og det liker våre motstandere å henge seg veldig opp i. Det lever vi veldig godt med. Så er det sånn at det ikke er alt vi kan hente fra USA, men det er noe vi kan lære. Amerikanske kristne grasrotaktivister, de er veldig flinke til å gjøre det som vi har gjort her, nemlig å reise til landets hovedstad og markere veldig klart og tydelig hva de står for, og invitere politikerne til å gjøre det samme. Og dit kommer de beste politikerne, de beste debattantene og de beste lederne innenfor den konservative bevegelsen. Og så er det jo sånn at i politikken så er det noen som har lært seg hva de skal si for å komme dit de trenger å komme. Det er ikke noe norsk fenomen. Og så har vi noen som er ekte vare, som står for det samme uansett om det blåser i ryggen eller i ansiktet. Som står for det samme enten det er populært eller upopulært. Det er noen sånne juveler i amerikansk politikk, og vi hadde besøk av en sånn her for 2 år siden. Michele Bachmann er en sånn juvel i Amerika som vi har funnet. Og hun ber ikke om unnskyldning, hverken for sin tro, eller for sine verdier, eller for sin bakgrunn. Disse stemmene er utrolig verdifulle i deres setting, og de er veldig verdifulle for oss også, til å hente inspirasjon og til å lære. Det viser seg veldig ofte når de går ut av politikken, hva det egentlig er som driver de. Og veldig mange de forlater politikken, og så prøver de å kapitalisere og tjene penger på sin politiske kompetanse og de kontaktene og de nettverkene de har. Det har vi i Norge, og de har det ikke i noe mindre grad i USA. Michele Bachmann er ikke en sånn. Tvert imot, hun har bare fortsatt i den kampen som førte hun inn i politikken, som drev hun i de 8 årene hun satt i kongressen og stilte som presidentkandidat, og det driver hun fortsatt, og det er et utrolig forbilde for oss. Det er noe annet vi veldig gjerne har lyst til å formidle og fortelle med dette besøket. Det er nemlig en del av vår historie her i Norge som vi kjenner til, men ikke godt nok. Og det er at på 1800- og begynnelsen av 1900-tallet så forlot over 800 000 nordmenn et fattig land og dro til Amerika. Det er faktisk, ifølge en ekspert som jeg snakket med forleden, det er flere som har norsk avstamning i USA enn det er i Norge. Og de hadde ingenting når de reiste. De hadde kanskje til og med lånt penger til billetten eller solgt alt de eide for å komme seg til USA. De kom til USA med én ting alene, de hadde med seg troen på Gud. Og de bygget kristne samfunn i Amerika. Og de samfunnene ble foredlet generasjon etter generasjon. Og 3-4 generasjoner etterpå så lever de fortsatt i dag og er amerikanere først og fremst, men veldig oppmerksomme på og veldig glad for at de har et norsk opphav. En av de er Michele Bachmann. Hennes avstamning er så norsk som den kan bli, like norsk som deg og meg. Hun har steget helt til topps i amerikansk politikk, men historien startet her med de som dro fra Norge, og som hadde med seg troen på Gud, bygget et kristent samfunn, og hun er et produkt av det kristne samfunnet. Og nå er hun tilbake her i gamle landet, for å gi oss en del av den velsignelsen som en gang forlot gamle landet. Vi har vært sammen den siste uken, det har vært en festreise. Vår beundring for Michele Bachmann, den bare vokser, og vi er så takknemlige for å ha henne her, og vi skal straks få høre fra henne, men først en liten film.
My name is Michele Bachmann. I'm a former member of the United States Congress and a former candidate for President of the United States. Most importantly, my background is 100% Norwegian. In the 1800s, my ancestors left Norway for the United States. They left poverty and in what was then a struggling nation. They set out for America because it was a land of hope and opportunity. More than 840,000 Norwegians migrated to the United States between 1825 and 1925, a 100-year period, and among them were all my ancestors on both my mother's and father's side of the family. They helped build a Christian community in the United States, and the church was the center of that community. That's the culture I grew up in, and the values of that originated in the Norwegian Christian culture. Those values are with me today. Being in Norway is a coming home for me. Norwegian relatives were kind enough to gather together to meet for the first time. I visited the Amble farm in Kapanger and Sognefjord, where my great-great-grandparents farmed. And I saw the Kapanger Stave Church, where my great-great-grandparents married only months before they left for America on a ship sailing from Bergen, Norway in 1866. I stood before the baptismal font where my great-grandfather was baptized. I stood in the Stave Church built in 1140, where my ancestors formed their faith. I'm at home and among friends here in Norway. I'm delighted to speak at the Oslo Symposium, celebrating the Christian values that built my family and built my nation in the United States and built my fatherland here in Norway.
Until you find your way back home.
I was born in Waterloo, Iowa, in the central part of the United States and a little bit north. It is heavily Norwegian. And so when I was a little girl growing up, all I knew was a Norwegian background. Everyone I knew was a Norwegian background. And the connection was the little Lutheran churches that we went to. Our identity and our pride was in our Norwegian heritage. My parents, their grandparents, the great-grandparents, the family stories, if you will, because we would usually get together on Sundays. After church, we'd go visiting and visit it in different people's houses. And the stories inevitably went back to family. And it went back to this one came from that part of Norway, or this one came from there. And our habits were the same. My mom said that the first question that was asked by her parents when she brought my dad home is, number one, is he Norwegian? That's what everyone wanted to know. And number two, is he Lutheran? And if he checked both of those boxes, they didn't care anything about him. As long as he was Norwegian, as long as he was Lutheran, that's all that mattered. The Bible was something that was reverenced in our home. And I think a big part of what I saw throughout not just our family, but I'm thinking of the extended family, the church family, what we saw lived out, the value expressions that came out of a belief and an understanding in Christ and in the Bible was the expression of really the observances of the Ten Commandments. My parents didn't have a great marriage. They did divorce when I was about 13, 14 years of age. And when that happened to our family, we went to below poverty overnight. It's very common in divorce that there's a reduction in the standard of living, and that happened with us too. We went from middle class. My dad had been an engineer. And when that happened, we lost everything, lost our home, lost the possessions inside the home. I took up babysitting jobs, and my brothers delivered newspapers. My grandma would drive up every now and then, and in her back seat, she had canned goods that she had bought. So she would supplement the amount of food we had. And so all through high school, we just didn't have anything. My mom owned 3 dresses. That's what she had. And I had very little clothing too. The one thing my mother did say when I was 13, she said, one thing that can never be taken away from you is your education. So you really need to study hard and you need to do well in school. And so I listened to her, and I did very well in school, and I always worked through school. And so I worked, did very well, and got myself through high school, through college, through law school, through a postdoctorate degree in tax law. And that was something that gave me a heart of compassion for other kids who had lost things. So we ended up taking 23 foster children into our home over the years. because the Lord broke our heart for other people in those kind of situations. About 2000, I ran for the state senate, and it was because of our foster children, because I saw what was going on in America's public schools. And I was very worried about what I saw my foster daughters bringing home in their backpack. I knew that they wouldn't get a strong academic education, and I felt if any child needed a leg up in this world, it's a foster child. Because of that, I ended up in politics, and ultimately, I never in a million years would have thought it, but I ended up running for president of the United States. And so to this date, I am the only woman who has ever run for the Republican Party nomination for the presidency. I was in 15 televised debates. I'm the only woman yet to date on the Republican side that's ever won a presidential contest. I served on the Intelligence Committee, so I had dealt with national security and foreign affairs on that committee. We dealt with the classified secrets of the United States. So I traveled around the world quite a bit dealing with this issue of terrorism, particularly Islamic-inspired terrorism. Barack Obama was very much lifting up the Muslim Brotherhood during the years that he was president. And from my perspective, the Muslim Brotherhood is the umbrella organization of about 70 different terrorist organizations. And I was instrumental in trying to expose the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood, not only globally, but here in the United States, and unfortunately, in particular, in the Obama administration. There's a lot of influence of the Brotherhood there. And I am grateful that I was willing to do that, because the easiest thing to do to stay in public office is to say nothing and do nothing. But that isn't the way that I went. The way that I went was to move the ball down the road in a way that would expose a lot of things that would be dangerous for a lot of people. And so I've done 3 things since I've left Congress. And one of those is that I have been a speaker. And so I speak a lot around the United States and around the world on a lot of different topics. I've been a part of a ministry for about 1.5 years at the United Nations. And so we've tried to bring biblical principles into the United Nations and also bring the gospel in particular to individuals there as well. So that's been something I've been a part of. And then another effort I've been a part of is the Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast. We've been going out and meeting with leaders across the world. God's miraculously opened up these doors of opportunity. And we've presented not only the gospel to leaders of nations, kings, prime ministers, presidents, and so we've literally gone to leaders of nations that are Christian-oriented nations, but also Muslim-oriented nations, more atheistic-oriented nations. And we've talked to them about the gospel. We've prayed for them, these leaders, and we've also talked to them about Israel and about this idea of maybe opening up an embassy in Jerusalem. So it's been interesting how for all of us, God uses the entire tapestry of our life for His kingdom. He is an amazing God, and the one thing I know from the book of Jude, it says that He holds us in the palm of His hand. And I have certainly found that that is true. No matter what our circumstances, He loves us, He has a plan for us, and He uses us to advance His kingdom.
Mine damer og herrer, det en stor glede å ønske velkommen. It's my great joy to welcome Michele Bachmann.
Thank you, Birthplace. Thank you to the Oslo Symposium. Thank you all for coming here and giving this time this evening. Thank you also to the television audience and to those who are joining us by the internet and through streaming as well. We thank you. I must say, as a person who has the DNA of a Norwegian coursing through my veins, it is a pleasure for me to be home tonight here in Oslo, Norway. When I was a little girl growing up, my dad had stationery made up, and on it, it said the world is divided between those who are Norwegian and those who wish they were. And that was very clear evidence of what it was like to grow up in our community. My forebears, as Bjarte told you, emigrated from Norway. And we were always told from the time that we were little that we were 100% Norwegian. And we should be so proud of our Norwegian heritage. Everything was Norwegian. The food was Norwegian. Our celebrations were Norwegian. Everything we heard about. Even my mother used to sing a song to us that I don't know the words, but when we were little kids, one of the first songs that she taught us was Paul sine hunna på haugen på slafsa på hund. So that's the song that we learned when we were little kids. We had no idea what it meant. Someone later told me it was about hens on top of a roof. That's what I heard later. But just to give you that background, that's what we knew, is that Norway was a very special place, and we should be proud of it. And so what did I know about Norway? What I knew about Norway is who my grandparents were and who my great-grandmother was. She was born in the early 1870s, but I knew her because she lived a very long life. And when I was a little girl, I went to the Lutheran nursing home that was established by Norwegians in northeastern Iowa to visit her. And I saw, as I knew her and saw her, I was also touching the world of the 1870s. And I was touching her world of her parents and her grandparents and her great-grandparents that she knew, reaching back as far as 1800. Because you see, we are all links on a chain. Every one of us are links on a chain. And the chain in my family, the artifacts we saw growing up in Iowa and Minnesota and the great Midwest in America, we saw the artifacts of the wooden trunks painted in rose mauling, often with a date. Or we saw a Norwegian sewing box. I never understood that it was a sewing box until I thought it was a candy box. And finally, I asked, and they told me it was a sewing box where you push these two things and took the lid off. We saw the rose mauling of wooden spoons that they would eat with, and various lace that they made, and this was Stavanger lace, and this was a different kind of lace. And of course, every Christmas there would be lefse, and then we all hid because there would also be lutefisk, and no one wanted to eat the lutefisk, but there always had to be lutefisk. There wasn't a day of my life that there wasn't a jar of herring, pickled herring, in the refrigerator, and my mother couldn't get enough of it. This was our world, and this was our life. And my mother told me that when she grew up in northeastern Iowa, the church that she went to was in the Norwegian language. She was born in 1931. And so her church was all Norwegian language. They sang the Norwegian hymns. They read from the Norwegian Bible. Norwegian newspapers were delivered to the house. And when she grew up, she actually was a foster child herself. She was taken in by a Norwegian couple that owned a farm in northeastern Iowa, very strong believers. And they paid for her, a girl growing up in the Depression. No one had ever gone to college in our family, not one. But this couple paid for her to go to Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, a college that was created by Norwegian immigrants. First of all, to prepare ministers of the Bible who would go out and preach among the Norwegians in that area, but then also professions. My mother went to the school, and at that time, you could go to college for 1 year and earn a teaching certificate, and then teach in country schools. And if you taught in the schools for 3 years, then you were given a full license, and you could be a school teacher. The values that were taught by our very modest grandparents, my two grandmothers both were factory workers, and yet one of my grandmothers every day subscribed to the Wall Street Journal, and she read the Wall Street Journal from cover to cover every day. She subscribed to Time magazine, a weekly news magazine. She read that magazine every week, cover to cover. She was the most well-read, literate person I had ever met in my life. People loved coming to her home because she could carry a conversation on any topic, and she did. She was a very engaging, charismatic individual, but she was a very modest person. But the other thing I knew about her is that every Sunday she was in church, not just as a participant, but she taught Bible classes to adults at their Lutheran church in northeastern Iowa. And this was back in the early 1960s. One thing that she desired more than anything else was to be able to someday go to Israel. Now, this is the 1960s. Israel had only been established in 1948. Israel wasn't even 20 years old. This was a factory worker living in a very poor part of town. She had absolutely nothing, but the one thing she wanted to see in her life was Israel. And so she put the money away, and she was very careful, and she saved, and she had enough money to go to Israel. And of all the pictures she brought, she was well-dressed every day when she went on that tour. She was so proud that she could get over to the land of Israel. Why? Because as she studied the Bible, she saw the number one character in the Old Testament is God. The number two character in the Old Testament is Israel. Because God has a story, the story of mankind that he played out through a specific people to put them in a specific land for a very specific purpose. Because you see, our story is all the same. Even though we are proud Norwegians in this world, in this room, and I am one of them. My brother took the Ancestry.com DNA test, and I want you to know the results came back a couple of weeks ago, and he is 93% Norwegian from the Kaupanger area in Sognefjord. So we found out that our parents weren't lying to us after all. We really are 100% Norwegian, and we are proud of it. But every one of us, whether we are Norwegian or whatever we are in our background, we all go back to the beginning story that is so faithfully recorded in a book that is above all books, in a book that is faithful and true, in a book that we put our trust, and a book that is proved true and faithful over and over again. It is written by the finger of a loving God, the Creator who made each one of us. In this book, we find that God made his highest and best creation, Adam and Eve. And when he made this creation, he placed them in this very perfect world, in a loving environment where everything was pure and life was good. And God said to them, enjoy everything I have made for you. Enjoy everything, eat of everything. There's only one thing you must not do, and it's this. You must not eat from the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And why was that? It's because all Adam and Eve had ever known was life. They had known life and perfection and a relationship with him. And if they would eat of that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, then they would know sin and they would know death. And a loving God wanted to keep them from that reality. This isn't a fairy tale. This is reality. Because you see, every one of us in this room are born in the same condition. We are born in a state of disobedience and sinfulness to God. That is what the Bible tells us. But God, even with Adam and Eve, at that very moment of sin, he didn't abandon mankind. At that very moment, he said, I have a plan for you. Because you see, Satan wanted to bruise the heel of God. And God said, I will crush the head of Satan. And so he did. And the way that he did that is he chose an individual, a man named Abram from Ur of the Chaldees in southern Iraq. And he said to Abram, Abram, come to a land that I will show you. And Abram brought Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his uncle, and Terah, his father. And he brought them. Terah died, but the rest of them came to this land that he gave them, Canaan. And in this land of Canaan, it was an evil land at that time. But God said to Abram, of you, Abram, I will make a people and a nation. And this is the land that you will have. And God then described the parameters of that land. We don't need to guess what this land is. God has given to us the very deed, the one deed that God wrote was the land that he gave to his chosen people. And why did he choose them? Because from this very people would come Messiah, would come the Redeemer of all of mankind, so that the sin that happened in the garden would be covered. And once again, all of mankind could then come back and be in right relationship with God. Because you see, no price could be paid. Not one of us. There wasn't one thing that any of us could do. There wasn't one thing that Adam could do, or Eve could do, or anyone could do to buy their way into heaven. They could never be good enough. Life isn't like a pan balance, where if you do more good things than bad things, that's how you get into heaven. That's it. That isn't it at all. If that was it, we wouldn't need Messiah. But we need Messiah because no one could ever pay that debt. And God gave us the understanding of how we come to him through Abram. It's written in the book of Genesis. It says this, and what is true for Abram is true for all of us. It says that Abram believed God, and that belief was accounted to him as righteousness. It isn't that Abraham did something. It's that God sovereignly chose him. And then Abram, by faith, believed a holy God and believed his promises that one day God himself would humble himself and come as Messiah to redeem us from our sins. That is the story. And Abraham believed. And for all time and for all people, whether from the east or from the west, the Bible is needful. And the Bible is true for those in the east. It's true for those in the west. It's true for those in the south. It's true for those in the north. That message of the Bible, of redemption, if you look from Genesis all through the Bible, the message is the same. It is the message of a loving God of redemption to call us back to him. That message came given, the law was given through Moses, and the Jewish people faithfully throughout history carried the law to benefit all of mankind. God spoke to the prophets, and he gave the law. And when we looked at the law and the prophets, that showed us what the future would be and how we were to behave and how we were to live. From there, Christians believe that Messiah came into the world, and that from Messiah, as he lived a perfect sinless life, then gave his life willingly on the cross. He gathered during his 33 years of life on this earth 12 people, the apostles, who he poured his life into. And upon his death on the cross, after living a sinless life and then coming back to this world where he preached and was seen by many, at one time 500, then he ascended into heaven to sit on the right hand of the Father, to wait and to prepare a place for us. And he said, I will go to that place and I will give you my Spirit to be with you. His precious Holy Spirit, that Spirit of God. God is one. Father, Son, Spirit, one. Indivisible, one. He gave us His Spirit to speak to us, to guide us, to comfort us, to teach us, and to bring us into all knowledge and understanding of who He is, to guide us. That Spirit of His and those disciples and those apostles then went across the world, from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the uttermost parts of the earth. And they shared the truth of His kingdom, and they turned the world upside down. In 1030, for 11 years from now, just think, 11 years from now, it will be the 1,000th anniversary of this message coming here to the Northland, to Norway. 1,000 years ago. That is a date worth honoring, memorializing, remembering. 11 years from now, I encourage all of you at the Oslo Symposium and all Norwegians to pause and be thankful for the greatness of this living word that came into this land of freedom through doing what Abram did, believing God and having that alone by faith be accounted to us as righteousness. That message came in to southwest Norway and began spreading all across Norway. A biblical basis and a belief in the Bible. This land, as you know better than I, was worshiping false gods. The very first commandment that God gave to Moses was this: I am the Lord thy God, who brought thee out of Egypt. Have no other gods before me. In Norway, there was worshiping of other gods, of false gods. And that had an impact on the people that lived here in Norway, the worship of false gods. When the worship of the true God came, the living God came into Norway in 1030, that began to change this land. And as mighty as the granite mountains are in Norway, that stone, so too were the hearts of the people. The stony hearts, God miraculously turned into hearts of flesh as they began to believe like Abram did, believe in this God of the Bible. And this land of Norway began to change and develop in a way that it hadn't before. When you saw from the video that we were in Kapanger in Sognefjord, when we stood in the stave church, the largest stave church in the world, that was my family's church. When we stood in that church, built in 1140, and I realized the wood that I'm looking at, the interior of this beautiful church that I am looking at, this is the original church. These are the walls. This is all the original building that was put up by faithful believers in 1140 AD. Christianity came to Norway 110 years earlier. And then the guide told us, but this wasn't the first church built on this site. There were 2 churches built before. So almost from the very beginning of this new biblical belief coming to Norway, a church was built on that very site in Kapanger. And the way that buildings were erected at that time, if you've been to that area, it's tall, beautiful pine trees, strong pine trees. At about 110 years of age, they can be used for building. They grow as old as 250 years. They're strong, almost strong like iron. And so the early Norwegians, when they were erecting the churches, they put them directly into the soil. Well, of course, they rotted. They didn't stand. That's why there were 2 churches. But they were given a special understanding, as Norwegians do. They're brilliant people, and they figured out a new way to build. And so they built with stones a foundation, a firm foundation. And in the stave church, they created almost like what we would call a Lincoln log or a tinker toy. They had a locking system where they built a building so strong that it could last 900 years. 900 years. How is that possible? What's even more profound is that they built a faith that lasted 900 years, almost 1,000 in this land. Each one of us in this room, each one of us watching by television or by internet, must be profoundly grateful that this great nation has been impacted by a biblical basis for nearly a millennium. Because of that faith, because of the truth and the freedom that comes from that faith, the people of Norway were a free, independent people with free, independent spirits, living as free men before a holy God. They profoundly took into their minds, into their hearts, into their spirit, the truth of the Bible that was preached by those who came in to give the truth of the Bible. Originally, it was the Catholics who came in. And then when the Reformation spread across Europe through Martin Luther, then the Norwegian church was impacted by reform. Lutheranism was then adopted in a major shift in Norway. There was an effort to read the word for the pride and the self and the betterment of the common man, so that the common man could understand the words and the truth of what the Bible says for himself, for herself. What Martin Luther called the priesthood of all believers, that there is no intermediary between God and man. And we could know his love. We could know his forgiveness. We could know his peace. We could know his assurance directly for ourselves, just as Father Abraham himself understood for himself. He walked with God. He walked with man. That is the heritage of this nation, to have hearts of stone turned to hearts of flesh. That began in 1050 and moved forward through the centuries. That stave church survived the Black Plague. That stave church survived leprosy. All that happened in Norway. And yet, as people we have times of periods of being closer to God, periods of being farther away from God. So too revival came through this land. I also had the privilege this week of going and visiting the birthplace of Hans Haacke. And I saw where he was born in 1771. I saw where the area where he was in the field when God sovereignly spoke to him, just like God sovereignly spoke to Father Abraham and called him to be a precious people in a precious land for the purpose of being a blessing to all the nations. So too, Hans Haacke was called by God. He was changed, and he was called to speak to Norway, one of the poorest countries in the world, to speak to them about entrepreneurship, creating jobs, and to spread the freeing message from the Bible, that we could be released from the power of sin over us. No longer to be captives, now to be set free. He changed Norway so much. The population was 900,000 in the time of Haacke. And yet he wrote 42 different books. 500,000 of Haacke's books were in the hands of 900,000 Norwegians. Think of this. There was nary a home that wasn't impacted by this man, who was impacted by the same Spirit of God that impacted Father Abraham and through believers through the centuries. And Haacke went across this great land of Norway and preached, as did others. Rosenius was another one who went across Norway, who put together congregations, and Haacke put together prayer houses because the Danish church wouldn't allow him to preach in a church. And so for 10 years he preached across this nation and turned it upside down, as the disciples had turned up the world upside down. He was a bother to the state church. And so they jailed him for 9 years of his life. But Norway needed his entrepreneurial skills. They needed to know how to create salt so that it could preserve the food so they wouldn't starve. And so the government let him out. He was very sick when he got out, but he used his skills. And he changed Norway because he changed the people of Norway, because he changed the hearts of Norwegians. But it wasn't he who did it. It was the Spirit of God who transformed the Norwegians as God had transformed Haacke. That was by the early 1800s. The Haacke movement went forward, as you know, all through the 1800s. Lives were changed, the economy grew, and then immigration started. In 1825, the big immigration started out of Norway. I asked those who were in Sognefjord when I was there, what was it? Was it a potato famine? No, they said. There were so many people. Norwegians were fertile. They were having a lot of children. But the land couldn't support the people because, as you know, less than 3% of the land produces food in Norway. There just wasn't enough for all of the people. And so the people began to emigrate. They started in 1825, but it really wasn't the big wave. In 1862, the United States President, Abraham Lincoln, was in the midst of the Civil War. Our war went from 1860 to 1865. But Abraham Lincoln did something very profound. He signed what was called the Homestead Act. And with the Homestead Act, there was an effort to have Americans move west, but there weren't enough Americans to fill all of this great land of America. And so we needed more people. And so the Homestead Act was passed. It was available to anyone who came to America. That news was quickly telegraphed to the people of Norway, who were in the process of leaving and emigrating out, looking for a better land. They were filled by faith. They were filled with the impact of Haacke. And so these Norwegians saw this, my relatives included. And in 1866, my great-grandfather, Anfinn Ambel, was born. His parents, Christina and Niels Ambel, also who were married at the Stave Church, they left from Bergen, Norway on May 5th of 1866. They spent 1 month in what could have only been a horrific sailing journey across the Atlantic to get to Quebec, Canada, and then make their way down eventually to Minnesota, where I live, and to Iowa. That's my father's paternal family. My mother's family came from the Lillehammer area. They came and they had nothing. We know that because of their own records. They had absolutely nothing. Everything they had was sold just to get a ticket to get across to the New World. So they hired themselves out as hired hands. They took advantage of the Homestead Act because, you see, the offer was 160 acres for free if they cleared the land and lived the land and worked the land and produced on the land for 5 years' time. What a bargain for most Norwegians. They couldn't wait to do that, and that's what they did. And so when you come to America, whether it's New York City or Wisconsin or Minnesota or Iowa or North Dakota or South Dakota or Seattle, Washington or California or so many other areas, 840,000 Norwegians made an impression on this nation. During the Civil War, measurements were made of every soldier. My great-grandfather served in the American Civil War. Right after he got off the boat, from Norway. They took the measurements of the soldiers, of all soldiers in the Civil War. The Norwegians were the tallest, they had the biggest chests, they were the strongest. They even changed the makeup of the American population because they were so big and so strong. But the most important impact that the Norwegians made in the United States was the faith that they brought to the United States of America, influenced by Haacke, influenced by the believers from years and decades and hundreds of years before that had come into this land. We have the artifacts. We have the wooden trunks. We have the rose mold dishes. But what is more precious is that we have their faith. We have their faith and the way that their transformed lives came into America. And the way that they came in, not demanding from the American government, you must give me something. They came into America and said, what can we do? How can we serve? Like my great-grandfather, who immediately joined the Union Army and fought for the end of the abolition of slavery. That's what Norwegians did when they came to the United States. The first thing that any Norwegian community did was erect a church. The very first thing they did. And if you come to visit all across the Midwest, you will see white wooden churches looking very much like a stave church, only painted, all across the Midwest, because that was the center of their world. They built the church, and then they had to have ministers for the church, so they built colleges, one that my mother had attended. They built up these colleges. Then they built up Lutheran social services. They needed insurance, and so they got together and formed an organization called Lutheran Brotherhood. The old people needed care, so they built Lutheran nursing homes, where my grandmother went and many other elderly Norwegians. They built every possible social service that was needed. Not once would they go to government and ask government, local, state, or national, to supply their needs. They were thrilled to be able to work, and then they banded together as a community. They were not selfish people. They were among the most generous people you have ever met. In the state of Minnesota, where Norwegians, as Bjarte said, are overrepresented in our state, we have the reputation of being one of the most charitable, philanthropic, generous states in the United States. That comes from a Norwegian heritage. It comes from that hard work ethic, and it comes from the belief in the values of honesty and thrift and working for your fellow man. When I grew up, we never locked our doors in our community. No one locked our doors. We didn't need to. Who would come in? No one would come in. It was a community that understood each other and did what it was supposed to do. You see, I was so humbled when I came back here this week. I'm the first generation since Christina and Niels and baby Anfinn left from the dock at Bergen. I'm the first generation that came back. Because you see, Norway to us was like Pluto or Jupiter. I mean, it was like somewhere far away in the solar system. We were not wealthy people. We could never imagine having enough money to come to Norway. But it was something that we always looked up to because we knew it had given us so much. And so now this week when I came here, I learned even more importantly how real this faith is that was built here in Norway. You see, the Norwegians, when they sent 840,000 people to the United States, they sent, unbeknownst, 840,000 missionaries into the United States who built up communities and helped to create what it today is known as American greatness. They made America great. They sacrificed, they did
But generation upon generation upon generation upon generation, they faithfully transferred that biblical understanding first known by our father Abraham. They're faithful people and faithful still. Not all. By any stretch of the imagination, I don't want to say that all knew that God of the Bible. But there's an overwhelming umbrella, an overwhelming sense that they brought with them. It was a biblical-based understanding, and the values and the way that they lived were informed by those values. As the United States has reflected those biblical values, we have been lifted up to what today is the economic and military superpower of the world. But as we reject those biblical values, you also find a deflating of that great strength. That's true in America, just as it's true in Norway. And so I say to you, I look at our ancestors. I look at our forebears. I look at the boldness with which they lived life, the boldness that they took on to leave everything behind, and you saw for yourself the most beautiful land on earth, Kapanger, Sangjefjord. How disappointed they must have been when they got to Minnesota and Iowa, and it was all flat. But what they did get was rich soil that could help make them rich when they added their hard work and their godly values. I'm here to say thank you. Thank you to Norway. Thank you to the faith of this great nation. Thank you to nearly 1,000 years of a godly heritage that this nation would be remiss not to celebrate for the next 10 years. You see, what would Norway have been if it had been left to the worship of pagan gods under the Vikings? What would any nation be if it rejects what Father Abraham embraced? We see that evidence across the world. And that's why for every one of us listening to this message, we too have that choice. We either accept that message given to Abraham, who believed God and it was accounted to him as righteousness, or we reject it. The choice is ours. The choice is for Norway, the choice is for the United States, but it comes down to the choice of the individual. When enough individuals in a nation believe as Father Abraham believed, then that nation becomes righteous before a holy God, and a people rejoice. God bless you, and thank you for allowing me to be here this evening.